The man's name was June, and he had nothing but a folded piece of paper in his pocket and the dust of Manila on his shoes. He stood outside a tower of glass and steel in Dubai, a building so tall it seemed to stab the pale blue sky, and the security guard looked at him like he was a stain on the marble floor. June had flown here on a one-way ticket bought with money his mother had saved for 7 years, selling fish at the Navotas port. He was a Filipino, a real estate dreamer from a country of dreamers, and he was about to walk into the office of a billionaire who had never once said yes to a man like him. The air smelled of expensive cologne and hot asphalt, and his heart was a drum beating against his ribs as the revolving doors swallowed him whole. The elevator ride took 40 seconds, but for June it felt like a lifetime trapped in a polished coffin. He could see his own reflection in the brass walls, a brown face, a cheap barong Tagalog that had been ironed 100 times, and the sweat blooming under his collar like a secret shame. He practiced his pitch in a whisper, the words his father had taught him before the cancer took his voice. Be proud, anak. You are not begging. You are offering a gift. The doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped into a lobby so silent he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. A woman with a diamond watch and a face carved from ice looked up from her desk and asked if he had an appointment. June pulled the folded paper from his pocket, a single sentence scribbled by a clerk at the Billionaire's holding company, a vague promise of maybe, and he held it like a shield. The waiting room was a museum of power. Leather chairs the color of black coffee, a fish tank that held fish more expensive than June's entire barrio, and walls covered in photographs of the billionaire shaking hands with presidents and movie stars. June sat on the edge of his chair, his calloused hands gripping his proposal folder, and he watched the other men who were also waiting. They were Arabs in crisp white kanduras, Europeans in suits that cost more than his mother's house, and they glanced at him with polite confusion, as if a stray cat had wandered into a palace. He had spent 2 years building this proposal, a low-income housing project for Filipino workers in Dubai, men and women who lived 12 to a room, who sent every dirham home to children they hadn't seen in years. He had the numbers, the land survey, the letters of intent from 100 families. He had everything except the one thing the billionaire demanded, a name that was not his own. The door opened, and the billionaire did not walk, he flowed, like a river of money and entitlement. He was tall, with a gray beard trimmed to a razor's edge, and his eyes were the color of old gold, scanning the room and finding nothing of value until they landed on June. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He simply said, "You have 5 minutes," and turned back into his office, leaving the door ajar like a challenge. June stood up, his knees trembling, and he followed the man into a room that was bigger than his entire village. The floor was a map of the world made of polished stone, and the windows showed a city of impossible towers rising from the desert. The billionaire sat behind a desk that had no papers on it, only a single phone and a cup of black coffee that never seemed to cool. He looked at June the way a lion looks at a mouse that has wandered into its den. June began to speak. He spoke of the 250,000 Filipino workers in Dubai, the nurses and the construction laborers and the maids who worked 18-hour days and still found time to pray. He spoke of their dignity, their desperate need for homes that did not cost their entire salary, for communities where they could raise their children without shame. He laid out his drawings, his financial projections, his partnership with a small but honest construction firm back in Manila. He spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, his voice cracking only once, and when he finished, he felt a flicker of hope, because the billionaire was not looking away. The billionaire was watching him with an intensity that felt almost like respect. Then the man leaned forward, picked up his coffee, and said 7 words that would change everything. "Your people are not my problem." The silence that followed was so deep that June could hear the distant hum of an airplane crossing the sky, a sound of something leaving without him. June did not cry. He had promised his father that he would never cry in front of a man who did not deserve his tears. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if accepting a truth he had always known, and he began to gather his papers. Each page felt heavier than the last, the maps, the signatures, the prayers of 100 families written in ink. He folded his proposal back into its folder, and he stood up, his legs now steady because they had nowhere left to run. He looked the billionaire in the eye, and he said, "Thank you for your time, sir. May Allah bless your business." He turned his back on the map of the world, on the city of gold, and he walked toward the door. He was halfway there when the billionaire spoke again, his voice softer now, almost curious. "Wait." June stopped, but he did not turn around. He could feel the man's eyes on his back, measuring him, weighing him. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" the billionaire asked. "You have no money. No family name. No army of lawyers. Yet you stand here as if you own this room. Why?" June turned then, and for the first time, he smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who has been broken and has learned that broken things can still be sharp. He said, "Because I am Filipino, sir. And my people have nothing. But we have never let nothing stop us from building something." He walked back to the desk, not as a supplicant this time, but as a teacher explaining a simple truth to a student who had never known hunger. He placed a single photograph on the billionaire's desk, a picture of his mother's house in the slums of Tonda, a shack made of corrugated steel and hope, held together by prayer and duct tape. In the photo, his mother stood outside, smiling, holding a pot of rice. She had fed 20 neighbors from that pot during the last typhoon. "That is my collateral," June said. "A woman who shared her last grain of rice. Can your banks offer you that?" The billionaire stared at the photograph for a long time. His golden eyes seemed to soften, just a fraction, like the first crack in a dam. He picked up the picture, held it to the light, and June saw something flicker across his face, a memory, perhaps, of a time before the money, before the towers, when he too had known what it was to have nothing. He put the picture down and leaned back in his chair. "You are either the bravest fool I have ever met," he said, "or the most dangerous. I will give you 1 dirham. Not for your project. For your heart." He reached into his drawer and slid a single gold coin across the desk. It spun in a slow circle, catching the light, a tiny sun on the dark wood. "Take it," the billionaire said. "And come back when you have turned that 1 dirham into 1 million. Then we will talk." June picked up the coin. It was warm from the man's hand. He did not say thank you. He said, "I will be back in 1 year." And he walked out of the office, out of the tower, and into the furnace heat of Dubai, holding that single coin like a promise. The sun was setting over Dubai, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, as June stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the tower that had almost swallowed him whole. He had no money, no job, no place to sleep. He had a single gold coin in his pocket and a promise that felt like a curse. He thought of his mother, boiling water for a soup with no fish. He thought of his father, who had died believing that his son would change the world. He thought of the 100 families waiting for homes that might never be built. And he laughed. It was a wild, broken laugh that made a passing businessman cross the street to avoid him. Because June knew something that the billionaire did not. He had spent his whole life turning nothing into something. 1 dirham was a kingdom compared to what he had started with. He walked into the chaos of Dera, the old district of Dubai, where the streets smelled of spices and diesel and the air was thick with the prayers of 1,000 different languages. He found a small mosque and washed his face in the fountain. Then he sat down against a wall, pulled out a worn notebook, and began to write. The first night, he slept in the back of a taxi that smelled of curry and sweat. The driver, a fellow Filipino named Mang Lito, let him curl up on the floor mats because he saw the coin and heard the story and believed in miracles the way only poor men can. In the morning, June washed his face again in the mosque fountain, bought a piece of bread with a fraction of his coin, and began to walk. He walked through the labor camps where his countrymen slept in bunk beds stacked 4 high. He walked through the construction sites where they hung from steel beams in the 100-degree heat. He walked through the small sari-sari stores they had built in basements, selling canned goods and dreams to each other. And everywhere he went, he told them his story. He showed them the coin. And he asked them for nothing but their trust. That was the thing the billionaire had not understood. The Filipino did not need a loan. He needed a family. And family does not charge interest. For 7 days, June walked the back alleys of Dara and the labor camps of Al-Quaz, and on the 7th day, something impossible happened. A woman named Elena, a domestic worker who had not seen her children in 3 years, handed him a crumpled 20-dirham note. She had saved it for a new pair of shoes. She gave it to June instead because she had heard him speak in a barangay hall the night before, and she said his voice reminded her of the priest back home who had buried her mother. June tried to refuse. He told her he could not promise returns, that there was no bank guarantee, that he was just a man with a coin and a prayer. Elena laughed in his face. She was a small woman with hands like leather and eyes that had seen too much, but her laugh was a thunderclap that made the other workers turn their heads. She said, "Boy, I have trusted men who promised me the moon and gave me nothing. At least you promise me nothing and look me in the eye when you say it. That is already more than I have ever gotten." She pushed the note into his palm and walked away, her worn slippers slapping the concrete like a drumbeat of defiance. That night, June sat on the floor of Mang Lito's taxi and counted the money. It was not much, 347 dirhams from 17 different people, some of them giving their last coins, others giving notes folded into tiny squares like prayers. He laid them out in rows on the dirty carpet, and he felt the weight of each one pressing down on his chest. This was not capital. This was sacrifice. This was a mother's shoes, a father's medicine, a child's school fees. He put his head in his hands and he almost broke. Because now failure was not just his own shame. It would be their hunger. He thought about the billionaire sitting in his cold office, sipping coffee that cost more than these people made in a week. He thought about the word no. And then he thought about Elena's laugh, that thunderclap of trust, and he knew he could not stop. He picked up his notebook and began to draw again, not a housing project this time, but something smaller, something meaner, something that a poor man could touch with his own hands. The idea came to him 3 days later, in a place where ideas should never come, a fish market. He was helping Mang Lito deliver a fare to the port when he saw the Filipino fish cleaners sitting on overturned buckets, gutting catch after catch with knives that had been sharpened down to slivers. They worked in silence, their hands bleeding from the cold and the scales, and beside them sat their children, small brown faces smeared with fish guts, doing homework on the wet concrete. June stopped walking. He stared at those children, and he saw something he had not seen before. They were not sad. They were not crying. They were learning. In the middle of a fish market, with the stench of death all around them, they were learning. He turned to Mang Lito and said, "We are building in the wrong place. We do not need new buildings. We need new classrooms. And we do not need the billionaire's money. We need the billionaire's empty buildings. The ones he leaves vacant while he waits for the market to rise." He spent the next 2 weeks mapping every vacant property owned by the billionaire's holding company. There were dozens of them, office towers half-built and abandoned after the financial crash, warehouse complexes that had never seen a single box, retail spaces in malls that had never opened their doors. They were ghosts of broken promises, monuments to the billionaire's own failures, and they sat empty while the Filipino workers of Dubai slept in overcrowded rooms and their children studied on fish market floors. June began to write letters. Not to the billionaire, he was not ready for that conversation yet. He wrote to the Filipino community, to the teachers who had lost their jobs, to the nurses who worked night shifts and dreamed of something more. He wrote in Tagalog, in simple words that anyone could understand. He said, "There is a man who told me no. But his empty buildings do not know how to say no. They are waiting for us to fill them with our voices." He did not ask for money this time. He asked for time. He asked for hands. And the hands came. They came at dawn, before their shift started, and they came at midnight, after their shifts ended. They were carpenters and electricians and painters and plumbers, and they brought their tools in plastic bags and their children in their arms. June led them to the first vacant warehouse, a massive concrete shell on the edge of Al-Quoz, owned by the billionaire for 7 years and never once rented. The lock was rusted, but a Filipino welder named Rico had it off in 30 seconds. The doors groaned open, and the morning light poured into the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced like ghosts. June walked inside, and he felt the emptiness like a physical weight. Then he turned to the crowd behind him, more than 200 Filipinos now, their faces tired but their eyes bright, and he said, "This is not a warehouse. This is a school. This is a church. This is a community center. This is our home until we build our own." He picked up a broom, swept a single pile of dust, and handed the broom to the next person. They worked in silence for the first hour. By the second hour, someone was singing. They transformed that warehouse in 6 days. The carpenters built desks from discarded pallets. The electricians wired lights using salvaged cables. The painters turned the gray concrete walls into a mural of rice terraces and carabaos and the Mayon volcano. The women sewed curtains from old bedsheets, and the children wrote their names on the blackboard that Rico had built from a sheet of scrap metal. On the 7th day, June held the first class. It was not a grand ceremony. There were no politicians, no journalists, no billionaires. There were 37 Filipino children sitting at mismatched desks, their hands clean for the first time in months, their eyes fixed on a teacher named Aling Nina who had been a principal in Manila before she became a maid in Dubai. She wrote the alphabet on the blackboard with a piece of chalk that was down to its last inch, and she said, "Today, we begin again." June stood at the back of the room, and he did not cry. But he came very close. He reached into his pocket and touched the gold coin. It was still there, still warm, still a promise. The news spread through the Filipino community like a fire in dry grass. Within 2 weeks, June had opened 3 more warehouses. Within a month, he had 7, each one a different kind of miracle: a school, a clinic, a daycare, a chapel, a savings cooperative, a legal aid office, and a kitchen that served hot meals to anyone who could not afford one. He still had no money. He still had no billionaire. But he had something else. He had the loyalty of 20,000 Filipinos who now saw him not as a dreamer but as a brother. They gave him their Friday evenings, their Sundays, their spare dirhams, their secret recipes, their stories of home. And June gave them something in return that no bank could offer. He gave them dignity. He gave them a place where they were not maids or laborers or cleaners. They were teachers, doctors, artists, and builders of a new world. But the billionaire had not forgotten. And the billionaire was not used to being ignored. The first sign came on a Tuesday. June was teaching a group of teenagers how to write business proposals when his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. It said, "The billionaire wants to see you. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Same building. Do not be late." June read the message 3 times, and he felt the old fear rising in his throat, the same fear he had felt in that elevator 40 days ago. But then he looked at the teenagers watching him, their faces full of hope, and he remembered that he was not the same man who had walked into that office. That man had been alone. This man had a family. He finished the class. He ate dinner with Mang Lito and Elena and Rico and Aling Nina. He kissed the foreheads of the children who had fallen asleep on their desks. And then he went to the taxi, curled up on the floor mats, and slept better than he had in months. In the morning, he put on the same barong Tagalog, ironed now by Elena's careful hands. He touched the gold coin in his pocket. And he walked back into the tower. The waiting room was the same. The leather chairs, the expensive fish, the cold stares from the other men. But this time, June did not sit on the edge of his chair. He sat in the center, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, and he looked at the other men with a calmness that made them look away first. The woman with the diamond watch announced his name, and this time she said it with something that might have been respect. He walked into the office, and the billionaire was standing by the window, his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him. The city of Dubai sprawled below him, a kingdom of steel and sand. Without turning around, the billionaire spoke. "I know what you have done." June said nothing. The billionaire turned, and his golden eyes were different now. They were not cold. They were curious. And beneath the curiosity, June saw something else. Fear. "You took my empty buildings," the billionaire said. "You filled them with your people. You did not ask. You did not beg. You simply took. Why?" June reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold coin. He held it up so it caught the light. "Because you gave me this, sir," he said. "You said to turn it into 1 million. I have not done that yet. But I have turned it into something more valuable. I have turned it into a family that cannot be bought. And that family is now looking for a permanent home. Your warehouses are temporary. We want land. We want to build. The question is not whether you will say yes. The question is whether you want to be remembered as the man who said no to 20,000 people who built a city inside your failures." The billionaire walked to his desk, slowly, like a man approaching a decision he had been avoiding for a long time. He sat down, picked up his coffee, and did not drink it. He looked at June for a full minute, and in that minute, June did not blink. Finally, the billionaire spoke. "My father was a fisherman in a village with no name," he said. "He had nothing. He gave me a single coin and told me to make something of myself. I made this." He waved his hand at the city outside the window. "And I forgot. I forgot what it was like to have nothing. I forgot that the coin was never the treasure. The trust was." He set down his coffee and opened a drawer. He pulled out a folder, thick with papers, and slid it across the desk. "It is a deed," he said. "For a piece of land in Al Furjan. It is not large. But it is yours. No interest. No payments for 5 years. And after that, we talk again. Not as billionaire and supplicant. As partners." June stared at the folder. He did not reach for it. He said, "Why?" The billionaire smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "Because you taught me that a man who has nothing can still be rich. And a man who has everything can still be poor. Take the land, June, build your homes. And send me a photograph of the first family who moves in. I want to remember what I almost lost." June did not take the folder immediately. He stood there, his hand hovering over the deed, and he felt the weight of every single person who had trusted him pressing down on his shoulders. Elena's 20 dirhams. Mang Lito's taxi floor. The children studying in the fish market. The teachers who had given up their Sundays. He looked at the billionaire's face, searching for the trap, because in his experience, rich men did not give away land for free. But all he saw was a tired old man who had just admitted that he had forgotten something important. June picked up the folder. He did not say thank you. He said, "I will send you the photograph." And then he said something that surprised even himself. "I want you to come to the first housewarming. Bring your father's coin. We will show you how Filipinos celebrate." The billionaire blinked, and for a moment, the mask of power slipped, revealing something raw and almost childlike. He nodded once, a small jerky motion, and then he turned back to his window, dismissing June without a word. But as June walked to the door, the billionaire spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "My father died before I could show him what I built. Show me what you build. I will bring his coin." The next 6 months were a blur of cement and sweat and miracles. The land in Al-Furjan was a barren rectangle of sand, baking under the desert sun, but to June, it was the most beautiful place on earth. He moved out of Mang Lito's taxi and into a construction trailer on the site, sleeping on a cot beside the blueprints, waking at 4 each morning to the call to prayer from a nearby mosque. The Filipino community came in waves. The carpenters came on their days off. The electricians came after their night shifts. The women came with pots of adobo and pancit, feeding the workers while the children carried bricks and fetched water. Rico the welder built the steel frames. Aling Nina designed the community garden. Elena, who had given June her first 20 dirhams, insisted on laying the first brick with her own hands. She was diagnosed with a cough that would not go away, but she refused to see a doctor. "There is no time," she said, laughing that thunderclap laugh. "We have homes to build." June made a note to force her to the clinic as soon as the first building was finished. The first building rose slowly, like a flower pushing through concrete. It was a simple structure, 3 stories high, with 12 apartments and a common room on the ground floor. June had designed it himself, borrowing ideas from the barangays of his childhood: wide windows for the breeze, a covered courtyard for the children to play, a shared kitchen where neighbors could cook together. It was not beautiful by Dubai standards. It was not glass and steel. It was concrete and prayer and the stubborn refusal to give up. But when the last brick was laid and the last wire was connected, June stood on the roof and looked out at the city of billionaires in the distance, and he felt something he had never felt before. He felt like he belonged. He climbed down the ladder, walked to the front door, and taped a handwritten sign to the concrete wall. It said, "Bahaying Pag-asa. House of Hope." The first family would move in tomorrow. That night, Elena's cough became blood. June found her sitting on the steps of the new building, her hands trembling, a dark stain on her white shirt. She was still laughing, that thunderclap, but it was weaker now, a distant roll of thunder before the storm. June carried her to Mang Lito's taxi, and they drove through the neon-lit streets of Dubai, past the towers and the malls and the hotels where Elena had spent 15 years cleaning other people's rooms. She watched the lights pass through the window, and she said, "I always wondered what this city looked like from a car. It is beautiful." June held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The clinic was a white building with a crescent moon on the sign, and the doctor was a young Egyptian woman with kind eyes who took Elena into a back room and closed the door. June waited in the plastic chairs, Mang Lito beside him, and they did not speak because the silence was a prayer. The doctor came out after an hour, and her face told the story before her mouth could form the words. "Advanced tuberculosis. She has maybe 3 months. Maybe less. She needs to stop working. She needs rest. She needs a miracle." June sat in that plastic chair for a long time after the doctor left. He thought about Elena's 20 dirhams, her thunderclap laugh, her refusal to see a doctor because there were homes to build. He thought about the children in the fish market, the teachers on the warehouse floor, the billionaire's coin spinning on the desk. He thought about his father, who had died believing that his son would change the world. And then he thought about the first family who was supposed to move into Bahaying Pag-asa tomorrow. He stood up. He walked back to the construction site, but he did not go to his trailer. He went to the new building, climbed the stairs to the top floor, and stood in the empty apartment that was supposed to be Elena's. He had saved it for her, the biggest one, with a window facing east so she could watch the sunrise. He had not told her. He had wanted it to be a surprise. He sat on the concrete floor, put his head in his hands, and for the first time since his father's funeral, June cried. He cried until his chest ached and his throat was raw, and when he had no tears left, he heard a sound behind him. It was Elena. She had taken a taxi from the clinic, and she was standing in the doorway, her white shirt still stained with blood, but her eyes were bright, and her mouth was curved into that impossible smile. She said, "Boy, why are you crying? This is my home. And I am home. The next morning, the first family moved in. They were a young couple named Ben and Rosa, with twin daughters who had never slept in a real bed. Ben was a construction worker who had lost 3 fingers in an accident. Rosa was a cleaner who had not seen her own bed in 4 years because she slept on the floor of her employer's maid's room. The twins were 7 years old, and they had never attended a single day of school. June handed them the keys, and Rosa cried. Ben shook June's hand with his mangled fingers, and he said, "You have given us a palace." June shook his head. "No," he said. "You gave me your trust. This is just concrete. You are the palace." He stepped aside, and the family walked into their new home, the twins running from room to room, their laughter echoing off the bare walls. June watched them, and he felt Elena's hand slip into his. She was weak now, leaning on a cane, but her grip was still strong. She said, "One down." "How many more?" He said, "As many as it takes." She laughed, that thunderclap, and this time it did not bring a storm. It brought the sun. June sent the photograph to the billionaire the next day. It was not a photograph of the building or the deed or the grand opening. It was a photograph of the twins, sitting on their new beds, holding hands, their faces lit by the morning sun. He wrote a single line in the message. "The first family. Their names are Maria and Isabella. They have never had a home before." The billionaire replied within minutes. "I am sending a truck." It arrived 3 hours later, a massive container truck that parked outside Bahaying Pag-asa and disgorged its contents onto the sand. There were beds, 50 of them, brand new, still wrapped in plastic. There were desks, 100 of them, solid wood. There were books, thousands of them, in Tagalog and English. There were sacks of rice, cases of canned goods, boxes of school supplies, and at the very bottom of the truck, wrapped in a velvet cloth, a single frame. June opened the frame. It was a photograph of an old man in a fishing village, standing in front of a hut made of bamboo, holding a single gold coin. On the back, in handwriting that was shaky with age, were the words, "My father." He never saw a tower. But he saw this. "Show me more." The months that followed were the best and worst of June's life. The second building went up faster than the first, and the third faster than the second. The Filipino community grew from 20,000 to 50,000, as word spread across Dubai that there was a place where a poor man could build a home with his own hands. The billionaire kept his word, visiting the site once a month, always in plain clothes, always without his bodyguards. He sat with the workers, ate their adobo, played chess with the old men, and held the babies. He never spoke of money or deals. He spoke of his father, of the fishing village, of the coin that had started everything. One afternoon, he took June aside and handed him an envelope. Inside was a check for 1 million dirhams. No interest. No repayment schedule. No conditions. June stared at the check, and then at the billionaire. "Why now?" The billionaire looked out at the buildings, at the children playing in the courtyard, at Elena sitting on a bench in the sun, her cane beside her, her laughter still echoing. "Because you turned 1 coin into this," he said. "And I want to see what you turn 1 million into." June folded the check into his pocket, next to the gold coin, and he said, "I will show you." Elena died on a Tuesday, just as the sun was rising over the east-facing window of her apartment. June was holding her hand. Mang Lito was sitting at the foot of her bed, his face wet with tears. The twins, Maria and Isabella, had drawn her a picture, a crayon drawing of a woman with a thundercloud above her head and the word laugh written in crooked letters. Elena had asked to see it one last time. She had looked at it, smiled, and closed her eyes. That was it. No drama. No final words. Just a woman who had given her last 20 dirhams to a stranger, who had laid the first brick of a new world, who had laughed in the face of everything that tried to break her. June did not cry. He had done his crying on the concrete floor. Instead, he kissed her forehead, stood up, and walked outside. The entire community was waiting. They had heard the news through the network that June had built, the same network that had spread the first call for help. They stood in silence, 5,000 Filipinos in the morning light, and they did not speak because there were no words. June looked at them, and he said, "She would want us to build. So let us build." He picked up a brick, laid it on the foundation of the fourth building, and 5,000 Filipinos picked up their own bricks. They built in silence that day, but by the afternoon, someone was singing. It was Elena's song, a folk song from her province about a bird that flies over the sea and never tires. By evening, 5,000 voices were singing it together, and the sound carried across the desert, past the towers of the billionaires, past the malls and the hotels, until it reached the ears of a tired old man in a glass office. He put down his coffee, walked to the window, and listened. Then he picked up his phone and called June. He said, "I heard the singing. Build faster. I am running out of empty buildings to give you." 1 year after the billionaire had slid that first coin across the desk, June stood on the roof of the 12th building and looked out at what they had built. 12 buildings. 340 apartments. A school. A clinic. A community center. A playground. A garden. A chapel. He had turned 1 dirham into 1 million, and 1 million into a village. The billionaire stood beside him, wearing a simple white kandura, no watch, no diamond cufflinks, just an old man and a young man looking at a miracle made of concrete and hope. The billionaire reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of his father. He held it up so the old man in the picture could see the buildings. He said, "I finally showed you." June reached into his own pocket and pulled out the gold coin. It was worn now, the edges smooth from being touched 1,000 times. He held it out to the billionaire. "Take it back," he said. "Your father gave it to you. You gave it to me. Now give it to someone else. Find another fool with nothing but a dream. Give them 1 dirham. And tell them to come back when they have turned it into 1 million. The billionaire took the coin. He held it in his palm, and for a moment, he was not a billionaire. He was a fisherman's son, standing on a dusty shore, holding a promise. He nodded, slipped the coin into his pocket, and said, "I know just the fool. She is a nurse from Cebu. She has a plan to build a birthing clinic. She needs 1 dirham." June smiled. He looked down at the village below, at the children playing, at the women cooking, at the old men playing chess, at the twins drawing pictures on the sidewalk. He thought of Elena, of his father, of the fish market and the taxi floor and the long walk through the labor camps. He thought of the word no, and how it had felt like a door slamming in his face. But doors, he had learned, were just wood and metal. And a man with nothing but a dream and a family behind him could knock down any door in the world. He turned to the billionaire and said, "Then what are we waiting for? Let us go find her." They walked down the stairs together, past the apartments where families were eating dinner, past the clinic where a new baby had just taken its first breath, past the chapel where a choir was practicing Elena's song. They walked out into the desert night, under a sky full of stars that did not care about billionaires or coins or the color of a man's skin. And somewhere in the city of towers, a nurse from Cebu was folding a letter into her pocket, a letter that began with the words, "I have a dream." She did not know it yet, but a fisherman's coin was already spinning in the darkness, heading her way.